She laughed at my shoes, Leela Lang said, loud enough for the glass to tremble and the fluorescent light to register a tiny human annoyance. Is that really your ring? Looks like something from a thrift store. The room tightened like a held breath. It was a Monday morning ritual. Credentialed people arranged around an expensive table, a PowerPoint on the screen pretending to be destiny, half a dozen polite smiles. Leela's remark landed like a match. Some people smiled because they were afraid of silence. Others smiled because they'd been taught to align themselves with whoever was loudest. Rebecca Hson did not smile at all. Her hand, the one with the plain gold band that never left her finger, lay flat on the table, as if it were still at home in its own pocket of memory. Rebecca had spent 6 years learning the acoustics of being unseen. She could hear who had cookies in their desk drawers and who forwarded passive-aggressive messages after hours. She knew the cadence of the copier, the exact frequency the HVAC coughed when the servers came under load, and the tiny habits people rely on privately. How Martin from legal always tapped a pen like a nervous metronome. How the assistant in marketing practiced lip gloss application in the reflection of a computer screen. She could recite every management buzzword in the company's deck, but she wore none of them. The ring on her finger was a soft, almost invisible protest. No logo, no sparkle, just a narrow band smoothed by time. Leela's shoes, brand name, deliberately new, a mechanical clicking that announced arrival from the corridor, were the sort of thing the office cataloged as status. She was used to owning space with the volume of her heels and the price tags of the people who noticed them. Mocking a colleague's jewelry was performance art for her, a wink to the social chart that put her and her father, Richard Lang, near its top. Rebecca watched the laughter curdle into that familiar office silence. She felt it as an inward flip, like a book being closed carefully after someone has read the footnotes. "Rebecca, right? Operations?" Leela said, leaning forward as if to read the nameplate. "Are you sure you're in the right meeting? This is for executives, not vintage jewelry enthusiasts." There is an untranslatable sound when entitlement meets someone who won't bend. It isn't anger, it is an expectant pause, as if the entitled party wants the room to take attendance for their scorn. The room complied. Some nods, a cough, the sound of a throat clearing that tried to resolve itself into humor. For a heartbeat, Rebecca all spoke. She could have mentioned the ring's origin, the small family story that no one here would have cared about beyond a curiosity. She could have flared, pointed out Leela's inability to measure dignity, but she had learned a different calculus over 6 quiet years. The person most likely to win office fights was rarely the loudest.
"You're Elias Rourke," Richard said, standing up in that half-invited, full welcome way executives have. "We appreciate you." Elias's eyes were on Rebecca before the sentence reached the end. "Stop," he said, simply, and the word acted like a steel bar across the room's script. The presenter minimized his slides mid-paragraph. Phones lowered. The murmurs of colleagues, those private sousings of gossip, fell into the kind of hush that's usually reserved for courtrooms or funerals. "Excuse me?" Leela said, a tremor in her voice that she smoothed with a practiced inhale. She tried to laugh. It cracked like cheap crystal. Elias took 2 steps across the room and stopped at the rim of the table. He didn't look at the PowerPoint. He looked only at Rebecca's hand. "That ring," he said. It was not a question. It was the beginning of a sentence he had decided to finish elsewhere. His attention made everyone look again, as if their facing had been compulsory. "Where did you get it?" Rebecca felt the room pivot away from her with a curious speed. Leela flushed. Richard's jaw tightened. Someone's phone buzzed, and yet the noise seemed obscene under the weight of the moment. Rebecca lifted her hand like a small flag. "It was my father's," she said, even though every instinct told her to stay silent. Her voice was level, no accusation, no apology. She had learned the language of facts, short, exact, unimpeachable. Elias's thumb brushed the inside of the ring with a light that was almost memory. "Hson," he said, tasting the consonants. "Edmund Hson." At the name, something older than Monday morning snapped into awareness. For a disturbing beat, Rebecca expected someone to ask for confirmation, or to mock. Instead, Elias closed his eyes for a microsecond and then opened them with the kind of clarity a man has when he knows a ledger and its margins, the way other men know football scores. "You're not a contractor," Elias said. "You're not operations. You're a Hson." It landed like a simple truth dropped into the middle of the table, and the table obliged it back with the same clean, fatal light. The presenter's mouth shaped a question he did not voice aloud. Everyone had termed Rebecca's work as operations, to make it digestible, to put it into a neat, non-threatening category. The room's taxonomy shifted by syllable. "Did you know him?" Leela blurted, outraged and relieved, a combo that often described those who were used to having the floor. How can you... Elias didn't answer the question in the way Leela hoped. He spoke instead to everyone in the room with an economy that felt like ownership of history. "Edmund and I..." He paused, then shrugged in a way that suggested this was not a confession so much as a matter-of-fact correction. "You." He pointed only to Rebecca. No one moved to close that gulf of history, because no one in that room had been invited into it. The sound in the room was mostly the subtle, horizontal whisper of the air conditioning and the way people listen to an unexpected cadence of words. Elias walked to the head of the table and put his portfolio down. He did not open it. Instead, he looked at Richard Lang as if assessing the reliability of a bridge in mid-construction. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," he said, and there was no insincerity in his tone. It was simply a condition. But I can't ignore a legacy when it sits in the hands of someone meant to represent it. He took another breath and then said something that made the PowerPoint cursor freeze in its tracks. "We need to stop this meeting." The room obeyed as if it were a body that had been given an order by its central nervous system. Chairs scraped. The presenter shut his laptop. Richard rose, looking suddenly smaller than the leather of his chair. Leela, who moments before had been the storm center, had nowhere to land her storm, and she began to look not angry but astonished. Rebecca sat very still. She had not asked for this. She had not expected an interlocutor who would recognize an insignia ground down by time. She was not seeking vindication. She was, in a way, simply fatigued by the amount of attention concentrated in the wrong direction across the years. She had built a lot of small things to keep big things from falling apart. That the ring could summon history, any history, felt like a strange reward. Elias turned to her as the room thinned into aftershocks. "Can we speak privately?" he asked. It was less an invitation and more a summons. Richard, muttering about schedules and hospitality, tried to assert control. "We can schedule coffee, Elias. This is a..." But Elias had the texture of a man who had learned to cut meetings at the core when necessary. "Not later," he said. "Now." "Excuse us for a minute," Rebecca said to the room, and her voice was simple. She rose and followed. Her feet made a peculiar sound on the carpet. No heels, no show. When they reached the hallway, Elias closed the glass door behind them with that quality of finality he wore like a coat. The hallway smelled faintly of citrus cleaners and the kind of polishes corporate offices use to remind employees that surface matters. The elevator doors across the lobby flashed a polite ding. A receptionist tried to smile supportively, and her smile was a cautionary flag. This was the kind of moment that should be redacted from calendars. Elias scanned Rebecca quickly, then looked at the ring again. "You didn't know the mark was there," he said. It was more a thought than an accusation. "Your father didn't tell you?" Rebecca thought of her father's hands on the ring. She thought of how he had arranged his life not to burn bridges, but to pin them down in place. "He told me to keep it," she said. "He warned me about being seen."
"And yet you prefer to be invisible," Elias said, like a clinician offering diagnosis. The words weren't unkind. They were the historical interpretation of an action. Not everyone hides well. She let that be. The silence between them had weight. It allowed her to measure Elias in the way she measured machinery, attention to detail, the space where a gear might bind. He was not a man prone to elaborate displays. His hands did not twitch, and his eyes were like well-lit rooms, functional, organized. "I stopped the meeting," he said, "because I think there's something in this company that needs straightening." Rebecca's first response was a reflexive modesty. "I don't want anything," she said quickly. "I don't want..." Elias smiled then, a contracted thing that did not reach his jaw. "You never do," he said softly, "but the thing you carry isn't something you can shelve." He pulled out a business card and handed it to her, but not the sort worn for convenience. This one had a small logo she recognized from her father's papers, a faint line drawing of a harbor's gate, Hellerson Holdings' old emblem. Her fingers brushed it and found the metal of the ring warm from her palm. By the time they returned to the boardroom, the dynamic had subtly reconfigured. Chairs were no longer just chairs. Eyes had become inventory. Richard's smile had hardened into a managed expression that said, "I am still the head, but do not test me yet." Leela had retreated into a small, private fury that no one was allowed to notice. Conversation resumed in a lower key. The presenter attempted to steer, but the current had changed.
The PowerPoint progressed, but the audience listened to the gaps instead of the slides. "He's proposing something?" Leela mouthed at her father, but he only shook his head minutely, an admonishing gesture. "Keep the script," it said. "Don't be the storm." Elias spoke once before he left. He closed his portfolio as if he had decided a small and necessary thing. "The Hallerson name matters," he said. "There are agreements, historical ones, that reach differently than current titles. I think your firm needs to respect its institutional memory." The phrase institutional memory had the effect intended. Arms folded across torsos like file folders. People looked at one another as if trying to locate which syllabus had prepared them for the idea of being the subject of history instead of the author of it. "What does that even mean?" the presenter asked. It was the question of a person who had been taught to expect corporate life to fit into 2 slides. Elias's answer was a faint half-laugh. "It means some contracts were signed in places where signatures carry a weight that outlasts boardroom chatter. Geneva, in particular, has a way of making agreements stick. My point is simple. We don't know everything about what was preserved for heirs. I would like to see who oversees that." A small commotion curled under the sentences like steam. Phone screens registered the exchange in invisible ways. People who had not been near the Hson files sneaked glances at each other, curious and a little terrified. What if the map they'd been navigating had an extra foot of shore beyond their chart? After Elias left, the room shrapneled into whispers. "He said Geneva," someone murmured. "Could it be?" Rebecca didn't answer. She felt something both heavy and chill sinking into her chest. Recognition had an aftertaste, like acid on the tongue. The room had changed in degrees she could measure. The air tasted different, like the calm before decisions. Someone brought coffee. The cups clinked in a lower tempo. Richard tried to arrange a new agenda. "We can bring legal in and circle back in the afternoon," he suggested, already moving into managerial triage. "We need to—" "We're not circling back," the person from legal said. The use of the first-person plural flared like a lantern. Someone had already primed themselves to be responsive and decisive. "If Mr. Rook believes there are historical obligations, we need to examine them now." And so the meeting did not resume in the way it had intended. It resumed with an altered purpose, which is often the same as suspending itself entirely. People began to concede that their PowerPoint projections were no longer the prime narrative. Speculation, that fine species of rumor, began to bloom in the corners. Rebecca moved through it with the narrow focus of someone accustomed to being the route through which things ran. She wasn't planning a coup. She sent a terse message to compliance, not an explosive email, but a quiet ping that was the corporate equivalent of flipping a single light switch. "Need review. Hson heir recognition. Geneva files." Short, specific, non-spectacular. She did it because she had kept a private list of where certain files lived, the names of the archivists who had been helpful once, the minor favors one keeps when one doesn't want to ask for a large mercy. Somewhere beyond the glass, a courier van coasted to a stop and let out a man with a small, curious box. He walked into the lobby and asked for the office manager. Inside the meeting, someone noted the knock but didn't attend to it immediately. The letters, compliance, and archivist began to hover like a new pair of people present in the room. A whisper traveled like a small animal, quick and always a little too loud. He said Geneva, he said heirs. The phrases were like dominoes. Once placed, they triggered others. Rebecca's message had a reply that read, "Access request placed, expect courier if validated." It was bureaucratic enough to sound official, and informal enough that it could be ignored by those who didn't want to see it. But Richard didn't ignore things that flickered at the edge of institutional memory. He stood and said, "We will pause this agenda."
"Legal will sort. We will not simply sort this," said another voice, firm and cold as the edge of a credit card. It came from Chairwoman Delgado, whose name carried its own quiet reputation. She had been watching the exchange with a poker player's attention. When she spoke, the room listened because her voice occupied the country between authority and consequence. "We will document. We will secure all relevant files. We will not let this become a rumor. Rebecca," she added, addressing her to the woman who had been quiet all morning, "would you come with me after the meeting?" Rebecca nodded. She did not know whether the request was an invitation, a threat, or both. She only knew it meant someone had noticed that she existed for a reason beyond tasks. Outside, the courier's footsteps echoed, trailing the scent of rain-damped pavement and cardboard. The office manager took an envelope that looked older than the building's brand and signed a slip with the practiced curiosity of someone used to occasional surprises. The envelope was thick, creased at the edges, and stamped with a seal that someone with an archivist eye might call deliberate. Back in the room, Leela watched Rebecca like a woman watching a magic trick she had not practiced. "So what now?" she said, loud enough to make sure her audience included anyone in earshot. "You shut up and let the adults handle it," a junior analyst said under their breath, which is office speak for "stay in your lane." The phrase was not intended to be kind, but it had the honesty that only the recently hired can manage. Rebecca, who had never wanted to be the center of anything, found that the center would not let her go. The ring on her finger felt heavier, as if the insignia pressed against her skin and translated old promises into a present weight. She had always imagined herself a watchdog. Keep the machinery lubricated, notice when screws were running loose, tighten what needed tightening. But this felt like being handed a key that had no obvious hole, and then being told to explain the legend of both lock and key. Keep calm, she thought, and the thought was not meant as advice to others, but in order to herself. Her father had taught her that visibility could be weaponized, but so could invisibility. She had a practice of tracing the ring's inner mark when decisions needed grounding. She did it now. By late morning, the lobby had a small flutter of movement. 2 men in plain suits had taken chairs by the reception desk. Their badges read compliance in small letters, and everything else in larger silences. They examined a chart, showed someone a black and white printout, and then made a call. They seemed to hold the space between curiosity and action like a ruler. At the periphery of things, an envelope made its way up the elevator. The courier, after some polite formalities, handed it to an assistant who had the right mix of discretion and mild panic.
The envelope itself wore a stamp from a Geneva archive, the kind of mark that suggested the past had been wrapped neatly and mailed forward like a petition. Back in the boardroom, chairs were rearranged. Richard called for a short recess while he assembled his own notes, as if rehearsing resilience could make it more real. Leela, fingers drumming a rhythm against her thigh, practiced indignation with a focus so fierce it looked like worship. "It's just paperwork," she said at one point, to anyone who would listen, the sort of blithe dismissal that can make a toxic office feel momentarily heroic. "Old lawyers and old signatures. This is just—" "It matters what it actually says," Rebecca interjected, softly enough that it could have been lost to the acoustics, but loud enough to change the flow of air in the room. "Language matters. Specific clauses can preserve things beyond usual governance. That's the point." No one thanked her for the lecture. She didn't give one. It was the kind of statement that belonged to people who had spent years cataloging the way things were written and what those ways allowed. She had no appetite for becoming a visible symbol. She preferred, still, the quiet work. Minutes later, the assistant returned and placed it on the table with the kind of reverence one reserves for relics. It sat between a stack of glossy slides and a board pen, a small island of paper that made a loud noise of being aged. "What's in it?" Leela asked, leaning forward. Her voice had an edge now, curiosity mixed with a need to displace shame. No one opened it immediately. There was a kind of ritual to that. Opening something with gravity inside it needed a decision to mobilize the room's collective attention. Richard looked to legal looked to compliance looked to Chairwoman Delgado, and Delgado looked at Rebecca for a moment that felt like a breath held by a person who had been waiting for someone to step into a doorway. "Rebecca," Delgado said, quietly, would you mind if I ask you to open it?" That phrasing was polite because it was power. It invited her to be the hand that revealed something, while also allowing the board to say they had not forced the choice. Rebecca took the envelope. Her fingers brushed the corner where the seal had been pressed so many times it had left a faint trace. The paper smelled faintly of old glue and time. She thought of Geneva, of a table covered in ash-gray maps and men who had smiled as they made words like protection and stake sound like small, necessary niceties. She slit the flap with quiet precision and drew out a stack of documents. They were brittle and stamped, and on top sat a single page with a header that made the room inhale, a founding agreement, dated and signed in a hand she recognized from certain photographs at home. Only she hadn't seen this copy before. The document's edges bore a notation in French that translated roughly to preservation of heirs' rights. The phrase sat there naked and blunt. The contents were not fully legible without a closer look, but the heading alone suggested a mechanism older than boardroom politics. Richard's face went a peculiar shade that suggested the immediate translation of panic into protocol. Leela, who had just seconds before been the loudest person in the room, shrank towards silence as if physics had taught her the wrong lesson about scale. Chairwoman Delgado folded her hands and looked at the document like a juror looking at new evidence. "This looks like the real thing," she said. Her voice was taut with the implication that the next minutes might rearrange careers. "Yes," said someone from compliance, the paper sliding under their thumb. "This is a Geneva-registered instrument. It references an undilutable stake and a clause for heir oversight." The words themselves were surgical. Undilutable stake and heir oversight were phrases that don't often appear unless someone meant to make their word outlast passing corporate whims. Eyes darted toward Rebecca as if there were now an index of her person in the sentence. Leela made a sound that could not reconcile the humiliation she felt with the indignation she desired. "You," she began, then paused, as if whatever word she chose would betray that she had been wrong to judge. Rebecca's lips were still. The ring beneath her skin felt like a quiet drumbeat, slow and patient. Somewhere down the corridor, a security door clicked. A phone buzzed, and then, like thinned lightning, people began to stand with a corporate choreography that indicated decisions were happening faster than the air could hold them. Richard reached for his phone. He called someone, then another person. He was a man who had been paid to assemble his list of allies with the speed of someone who valued contingency plans. But lists only mattered if the contracts they referenced hadn't already been activated. Delgado straightened and looked around the table. "We will need to verify," she said, and there was no softness in that sentence. "We will need to ensure that the document is authentic, that the clause does what it appears to. We will convene." "Pause," Elias said, unexpectedly, as if returning to finish a thought he'd left in the hall. He stood framed in the doorway, the corridor light making his outline sharp. That seemed like an odd restraint, given his role in halting the meeting. But Elias was not theatrical, he was precise, and precision in the immediate aftermath of revelation felt like a kind of mercy. Minutes strung themselves into an unnatural, elastic time. Employees outside the room hovered at their workstations, unwillingly aware that a ripple had passed.
Slack channels buzzed with shorthand, the kind that reads like secret code. HSON, Geneva, heirs. Those who were good at being unseen retreated further into their tasks, with the quiet dignity of people who maintain the heart of things without spectacle. Rebecca felt the room like a small, brittle island that had been thrown against a larger shore. It was not that she craved recognition, she barely believed in it, but recognition had material consequences. It called auditors and archivists. It spoke the language of obligations someone else had drafted on paper when no one could read their future. She thought of her father's hands one more time, the way he had smoothed that ring until it stopped reflecting light like jewelry, and instead became an instrument between dates. "No one is being accused," Delgado said, as if the room needed reassurance. "We are merely documenting. We will follow protocol." The phrase, "we are merely documenting," had the effect she intended. It suggested coolness and institutionalism, but it also meant the room now accepted that the quiet had been breached by something that required procedure. Procedure can look like safety. It can also look like a slow-moving blade. Rebecca slid the document back into its envelope at the boardwoman's request. The courier, having done his part, left as unobtrusively as he'd arrived. Outside the glass, the city took on its ordinary tempo. Cars, a street vendor, the unbothered shuffle of people with lives that did not, in this moment, revolve around a ring. Inside, however, the hum of corporate life had been recalibrated. People who had been certain of their positions now realized that paper could rearrange names on a chart. "Chairwoman," Richard said finally, the strain showing, "this is preposterous. If an old clause exists, it should have been registered with corporate. There are processes." "The processes are the very thing we will follow," Delgado replied. Her eyes did something that moved from suspicion to a thing like professional curiosity. "We will call external counsel. We will shut down all transactions until we determine the effect of this clause. We will—" There was a slight rustle at the door as someone from security pocketed his phone and moved to a new place in the room. People began to stand and gather their things with an odd deliberateness, as if they were all performers in a piece that had been retitled mid-act. Leela, whose attention had been sharpened by embarrassment, looked at Rebecca with an intensity that did not promise forgiveness. Rebecca stood. She felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the sudden need to be seen. Her life had been a ledger of small tasks and patient corrections. She had never trained for being public property. Delgado approached her and offered a hand. "We will need your cooperation," she said. "You may be called upon for testimony, for context." If the document is what it appears to be, there will be obligations attached to your name. Rebecca took the woman's hand. It was firm. "I will tell the truth," she said. "That's all I can offer." The words were not dramatic. They were, to Rebecca's mind, the only currency she had. She had never wanted power. She had wanted accuracy. She had wanted the world to speak honestly, so she didn't have to keep smoothing its edges into lies. As the room emptied into corridors and small offices converted into ad hoc tribunals, a murmur grew into conversation. The presenters left, the slides closed like books returned to shelves.
Richard retreated to his office, where he dialed numbers and glared at his reflection in a glass that no longer agreed to flatter him. Leela called someone who couldn't be reached, then another person whose voice dropped at the news. Rebecca walked out of the building shortly after, not because she wished to escape, but because the hallway felt too narrow for her new exposure. The city outside was not interested in her ring or any clauses. A mother pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. A bike messenger shouted at a taxi. Life, it seemed, remained brilliant at refusing to coordinate with institutional drama. She passed a cafe window and, on impulse, looked at her reflection. The ring, matte and slender, sat on her finger like a hinge between two halves of a life she had managed to keep separate until now. The idea that old papers in Geneva could bind the present was simultaneously terrifying and clarifying. It peeled away the thin film of things people had told themselves for years and let a more truthful light through. A message blinked on her phone from compliance. Courier delivered. Board to convene. Awaiting initial review. There was a file attached, an image of a page, barely legible, with a header that made her pulse stutter. It would have to be read carefully to mean anything, and meaning is always a practice of patience. Her father had once told her, "You don't inherit what you don't keep." He meant it as both a kindness and a warning. She had kept the ring because it told her to keep her eyes open. Now, the world that had been comfortable with her being small had been forced to ask whether small hands might hold obligations that were larger than gifts. Inside the building, lights clicked on at the security desk. A line of emails began to populate inboxes with subject lines that read like weather alarms. Hold on transactions. Request for archival certification. Immediate board convening. Names were being drawn into a new constellation. Rebecca walked away, as instructed by the same instinct that had taught her to remain unseen. Sometimes stepping back is the truest assertion of authority. She did not know what the clauses would say. She did not know whether the document would be authentic, or whether it would be a legal relic with no modern teeth.
She did not know whether Leela's life would be small and sorry, or whether Richard's position would be left in managerial tatters. She only knew that the room had changed because a man who could command the sound of a meeting had recognized an insignia. As she turned the corner, someone called her name. Chairwoman Delgado's assistant, with a message that had the cadence of someone delivering both invitation and instruction, said, "Chairwoman would like you to come to her office, now." Rebecca paused. This was not a summons to the public eye she would have chosen. This was the kind of request that meant the long work of institutions was about to meet the particularities of one life. She smoothed the cuff of her sleeve, felt the ring under her fingers, and walked back into the building. Somewhere in a quiet room not yet mobilized for its full consequence, a courier closed a folder and made a notation that a package had been delivered, one founding agreement, stamped in Geneva, tagged for attention. The notation would be a minor thing in an inbox full of other things, but in the present it existed like the first crack of a reveal. The boardroom, in Rebecca's absence for those minutes, began to reset. People arranged themselves into allies and bystanders, each choosing roles that would, for a time, define them. Leela retreated to Richard's side and watched the door as if she might conjure a different universe by sheer focus, as if a pinned look could summon a rewrite of the minutes that had just been authored by her embarrassment. Instead, she watched the room move without drama and with a kind of administrative violence that small offices practice well. Quiet, efficient, inevitable. Phones became tools again. People arranged themselves into the rules they trusted: defense, containment, spin, and the building hummed back into the familiar machinery of crisis management. Delgado closed the file with a sound that might have been judgment if sound were more daring. "We will assemble an emergency board," she said. Her tone carried the kind of finality professional women cultivate when they must neutralize ego with procedure. External counsel, archival certification, and a freeze on major transactions until they get a verified read. Richard Lang's mouth worked for a phrase to countermand that, some declarative thing that would reassert his chairmanship, but even he understood the difference between name and leverage. "Chairwoman, this is extraordinary. If a clause exists—" "It either exists or it doesn't," Delgado interrupted. "We don't speculate on what we don't yet possess. Speak to counsel, support compliance. Do not engage the market." Outside the immediate perimeter of the boardroom, things accelerated in the particular way of modern crises. Terse emails, a flurry of secure calls, compliance officers trading notes in a language of polite alarm. A junior associate at legal had a single thought:
If Geneva said something, then the language was going to matter down to the punctuation. They were right. Language, in the boardroom, did what muscle could not. Someone requested a calm briefing. Malcolm Brandt, founder in name and in the old photographs hanging like faint guardians in the firm's hallway, arrived not by accident, but by the sort of call you make when you suspect your life's work is being interpreted by people whose names you don't recognize. Brandt's presence was a different weather. He was the man who had watched the company through 3 recessions and 2 renaissances. He did not like surprises, but he respected the grammar of historical obligation. He entered the room with both hands folded behind him, an old habit that made him less aggressive and more like a man who'd seen every version of panic. "I heard there are papers," he said, and his smile was more theatrical courtesy than genuine ease. He scanned the table, his gaze falling on Rebecca with an interest that felt like appraisal rather than curiosity. Elias reappeared too, not as a shadow, but as an agent who had decided to lend the moment a particular gravity. He didn't seat himself at Brandt's side, he stood back, as if to let the institutional magnates conduct their choreography. But everyone felt the pressure of his presence, like a taut line. He had noticed the ring, and that was enough to pull history forward. Delgado laid the document on the table again, opened this time so that more than the heading could be read. The archivist from compliance, an older woman with a needle-like calm, tapped a single line and then another. "This clause," she said, and looked up at the assembled board, "is explicit. It calls for heir oversight and references a protective, undilutable stake reserved for descendants. It is registered under Geneva protocols. It's been preserved to prevent dilution." There was a silence so complete it could have been an applause. Richard's face altered in degrees, first confusion, then irritation, then something that looked dangerously like calculation. Leela's lips were pursed. Shame and outrage competed in the same small muscles. "You mean she could—" Belisa began, but the phrase hung incomplete, a child's sentence about ending a story no one wanted to tell. Brandt did not let it be Leela's moment. His voice carried the authority of someone who had been entrusted by markets and men to determine the fate of many. "If the document is authentic, which Delgado's team will verify, there are limits to what the board can immediately do without considering the contractual protections," he said. "That means any attempt to terminate or dilute rights attached to the name would be complicated, if not presently constrained, by the clause." There it was, the phrasing that made chairmen cough and policy teams breathe into paper sacks.
A clause that preserved rights for heirs did not necessarily mean Rebecca had to be offered a throne. It did mean the board could not simply erase the past on a whim. The company's governance, carefully constructed over years, suddenly encountered an ancestor who had written in capitals that no one should be able to erase his line with a memo. "We will need certified copies and counsel's opinion," Delgado said. "But until then, no major decisions related to ownership or transfer will be executed." "Wait," Richard said, pitching his voice that practiced balance executives use when they try to sound conciliatory but still command. "We're not suggesting anything illegal. This is about operations. We have clients to answer to, pipelines to maintain." Elias's answer was simple and immediate. He had the kind of currency most people in that room recognized. Not a ledger entry, but an action with consequences in money and reputation. "We will pause," he said. "My firm will suspend further capital movement until we have clarity. I can't, in good conscience, proceed with a partner where the governance may be compromised by undisclosed instruments." The sentence landed like a verdict. The room's mood flexed into panic, slowly but inexorably, because capital moves as fast as rumor, and faster than protocol. An hour's pause from a major client with visible influence could snowball into a retreat. Someone made the connection almost aloud. Other firms watch each other's exits and enter them like a contagion. "Is that agreed?" Elias asked quietly, not demanding assent but declaring intention. Others muttered compliance. A few silent phone calls confirmed what everyone prayed wouldn't happen. Webs of exposure were about to be tested. The market was a nervous animal. Even the whisper of withdrawal could quicken its pulse. As the boardroom assembled a plan to neutralize reputational risk, compliance began a parallel work, threading through contracts, cataloging communications, flagging any found discrepancies in oversight. The word breaches was used carefully. No one wanted to accuse without cause.
But the discovery of undocumented permissions, odd off-books allocations, and questionable vendor loops, what the compliance lead termed patterns inconsistent with governance, shifted the room's suspicion from ambiguity to probable fault. They weren't shouting fraud, they were cataloging evidence that would need a forensic eye. Leela sat in a corner like a child who'd forgotten how adults restored order. Her privileged belligerence had been blunted by a realization that her social capital might not translate into legal or institutional capital. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to a sympathetic assistant, who had the bad sense to muster an expression halfway between pity and pitying fear.
Security quietly escorted her from the room at Delgado's request a little later. Not in a dramatic tableau, but with the bureaucracy of someone asking a teenager to leave a concert because they were causing a scene. She resisted with a petulant flair, which was delicious to some and pitiful to others. The physical removal had the effect of turning her into an emblem rather than a person, a cautionary tale about how entitlement collapses under paperwork. Richard rallied, but his attempts to spin the moment into a managerial hiccup were undermined by two things: the presence of a binding instrument nobody at the firm had bothered to account for, and the fact that major clients, led by Elias, were withdrawing until clarity reigned. The math in his head, always his true other language, translated those pauses into numbers that refused to be politely aggregated. "Have someone run immediate liquidity projections," someone said, and the phrase had the impact of turning speech into arithmetic. Pings and chimes filled phones as the firm braced itself. The courier who delivered the initial packet returned with a metal box this time, certified copies, seals, embossed letters, and a notary who had traveled midday to do the work. He handed it to Delgado, who opened it with an efficiency that suggested she'd done worse things with people in rooms like this. Brandt watched the documents with a quiet hunger, like a man tasting a dish he once helped compose. "It's not only a clause," the archivist said, tracing a brittle line. "It's a legacy instrument. It's designed to guarantee oversight and prohibit dilution of the heir's voice in certain parts of governance. By the language, Edmund Henderson intended for his descendants to have a preserved say in matters that impact the company's stewardship." Every sentence layered pressure on the table. Men who had once felt safe in their roles began to whisper and cross-reference. Ties were straightened. Secrets that had been comfortable in darkness now found themselves in the fluorescence of a room that smelled faintly of lemon and fear. "Chairwoman," Brandt said, as if aware of the immediate need to reconcile legacy with present, "if these documents mean what they appear to, and if the Henderson line has oversight, we must consider that someone's been sitting on ancestry like a sleeping sword. This isn't about hands, it's about stamps and signatures. We should not be capricious." Delgado's eyes flicked to Rebecca. "Miss Henderson, this is obviously unexpected. Would you be willing to provide context, to tell us what you knew and what you did not?" Rebecca, who had spent 6 years cataloging small failures into no catastrophes, felt the map of her life fold flat and be placed between strangers. She did not want a spotlight. She wanted accuracy. "I'll tell the truth," she said again. "My father told me to keep the ring. He told me certain things he left in trust. He never handed me governance. He told me to look after things that could be broken if no one watched them." Brandt leaned forward. "Did you know your father's instruments were preserved in that way? Did he tell you specifically about an undilutable stake?" "No," she said. "He told me there were papers, and he told me to keep my hands steady. He did not discuss the clauses." Her voice was quiet enough that only those within the circle could hear. "He wanted the legacy preserved. But he also told me not to ask for what wasn't freely given." The board parsed her words like a code. Her refusal to claim power would come back to define her, but for now it shaped how others attached motive. Had Edmund left his daughter a path towards stewardship, or a vestigial key he expected no one to use? The debate was as much about intention as about form. While discussions of motive wove, the compliance team had pulled a preliminary read. They had found discrepancies, lines on ledgers that didn't match, approvals that lacked proper documentation, and a pattern of third-party arrangements that raised eyebrows. The words were cautious. possible non-compliance, inconsistent approvals, required investigation. That language allowed the firm to act without accusations, audits, freezes, personnel reviews. Those discrepancies, if confirmed, suggest mismanagement under the VP's leadership, the compliance head said. We recommend immediate suspension of any signatory authority held by the VP pending inquiry. There it was, the pathway from paper to personnel. Richard Lang had been the embodiment of power in that room 5 minutes ago. Now he was a man under scrutiny. He attempted to compose a statement about procedural normalcy, but the arithmetic of capital, clients pulling, counsel arriving, Brandt's prudent appetite for probity, left little oxygen for self-preservation. Within the day, the firm made moves that were as cold as they were fast. Richard Lang was placed on administrative leave. Security removed his badge. Access revoked pending an internal review. The board voted, a perfunctory gesture more than a contest, and formalized those steps with impressive speed. Leela's escort from the building was quietly visible to the staff, a young woman whose social altitude had been earned by volume, and who now sat on a lobby bench with a pack of her things, escorted by a security officer who moved with the dispassion of someone uninterested in biography. Word leaked like hairline cracks, and clients watched those cracks widen. Elias Work's pause had become a trend. 3 other major institutional partners followed suit, citing a need for clarity before further movement. The firm's stock, if the company were public, would have wavered. For a private firm, it meant a tightening of credit lines and the shudder of fund managers recalculating risk. At noon, the board convened an expanded meeting. Counsel, Brandt, Delgado, Compliance, Rebecca, and 2 independent auditors.
They sat at the table like people assembled for an autopsy of reputation. The auditors, practical men with black coffee and patient faces, opened files with the kind of serenity that makes panic feel petulant. Preliminary reads confirm that certain approvals do not conform with documentation standards, one auditor said. We found instances where vendor relationships appear to have been approved with insufficient oversight. We're not making criminal claims, we're noting breaches of governance and protocol. There were nods, and some faces drained color. Richard's allies quieted. Alliances restructure faster than officers. Brandt looked at each sentence and then at Rebecca with a measure of sympathy that did not disguise his managerial distaste. If those breaches are due to negligence or deliberate circumvention, the board will need to act, he said. And if there are gaps between the documented governance and the practice, we will need transparency in remedial steps. For Rebecca, the scene was both validation and tribulation. Validation because the quiet attention she had paid to small systems had been born out of necessity. Tribulation because it meant bodies, people she had known, would be judged by actions she had catalogued for years but had never publicized. Her silence had been an ethical stance more than cowardice. She now had to stand where it mattered and say what she saw. During the meeting, Richard attempted, in a clipped aside, to salvage his narrative. These are administrative oversights, he insisted. We've been aggressive in business. We take risks. Risk is not an excuse for poor governance, Delgado replied. We created a system to distribute risk fairly. If someone bypassed it, we have to know why. People made choices, said Elias, who had the peculiarity of speaking like a man who didn't want theater but would not shy from consequence. And choices have impacts. Investors and partners will want to know we have a transparent and accountable response. At the end of the afternoon, the board made several decisions. Lang would be removed as VP and take administrative leave pending the audit's deeper findings. Compliance would run a full forensic review. External counsel would evaluate the Geneva documents and the instrument's reach. Brandt, in a concession to reputation, called for a public statement that framed the actions as responsible stewardship, not witch hunt. Then Delgado addressed Rebecca directly. Because of the clause, and because Mr. Brandt and I believe institutional memory matters, the board would like to offer you a seat as an observer on the governance committee, with voting rights in matters of heir oversight, she said. It would be a formal acknowledgement of your family's preserved role in the company. It was the offer that would have made any ambitious person pause and measure their life against a new horizon.
Rebecca listened to the sentence like someone hearing a long closed door being unlocked. She could imagine power reframed as duty, influence harnessed to reform. The room watched for something. Gratitude, acceptance, surprise, as if she would play her part in the narrative they had been given. She didn't accept. She folded her hands where they wouldn't tremble. "I appreciate the offer," she said, "but I didn't come for position. I came because paper needed reading. My father left responsibilities, not ambitions. If the firm needs oversight, it should be built on transparency and rules that apply to everyone, including those in leadership." Delgado's face registered something between respect and pragmatic disappointment. "Are you refusing because you don't want responsibility, or because you don't want authority?" "Because I believe truth is better served by institutions that don't need heirs to rescue them," Rebecca replied. "If the clause exists, know it and respect it, but don't make me the test case for fixing governance that should have been fixed long before a name mattered." Elias, who had been quiet in the meeting, regarded her with a look that was more analytical than surprised. "You're offering us a moral check rather than a political one," he observed. "That's rarer than most people think." "It's not moralizing," she said. "It's simple calculus. Power changes people. I prefer to be the one who keeps the ledger honest without sitting where the temptation shifts." Brandt, who had seen innumerable men and women accept seats and then become owners of themselves rather than stewards of a legacy, nodded slowly. "Not everyone wants to be a steward in the formal sense," he said. "Some just want the institution to run honestly. That can be enough." Delgado considered for a beat. Then she did something pragmatic and kind. She made space for the board to offer Rebecca a different role, an advisory capacity with independent access to audit results and the right to call for special reviews, but without permanent seat-holding responsibilities. "We will formalize a mole that allows you to request reviews and see the documents," she proposed. "It's not a seat in perpetuity, but it's a mechanism to ensure that Hson oversight remains real rather than ceremonial." Rebecca accepted that. It was work without the trappings she had no desire to hoard. She wanted to be a brake on bad habits, not a symbol in a chair. When Delgado pressed a small pen and a piece of paper for her signature to accept the terms, Rebecca paused. Her fingers found the ring. For the first time since the morning, she took it off. It felt odd in her palm, cool and almost foreign, like a small private relic returned to daylight. When she handed it to Delgado, it was less an offering than a clarification. "My father wanted the legacy preserved," she said. "He did not build it to make a person into a trophy. Keep the ring, keep the papers, keep the obligations. I want only the truth."
Delgado accepted the ring and placed it in an envelope. No fanfare, a small administrative act, and then sealed it. It was the sort of ritual bureaucracies invent to make moral acts legible. The board placed the envelope in a locked drawer under Brandt's watch. The symbolism was nearly as strong as the legality. The ring, the paper, the name, they belonged to a history now invoked rather than hidden. Then, in the office corridor that had held the first movements of Monday's drama, something less institutional and more human took place. As Rebecca gathered her things, a group of colleagues she had never expected to see at her side hovered near. A receptionist who remembered the soft way she'd always answered questions, the junior analyst who'd once borrowed a stapler, Martin from legal, whose nervous pen tapping had once been the only known tempo in an otherwise cacophonous place. They didn't make speeches. They only made room. Outside, as the afternoon light had the temerity to soften glass and make the city's towers look less like challenges and more like props, Rebecca walked toward the revolving door. She had returned the ring to the board as a symbol, an object that had been the hinge of the day. Now, walking away, she felt both lighter and curiously exposed. Leela, by then escorted through a separate exit, watched from a side window as Rebecca's silhouette moved into the street. There was no satisfaction in her gaze, only the beginning of a private calculus about what she had lost. Richard, reduced in access and with contacts dwindling, slumped into a chair and dialed numbers that refused to answer. The building, which had minutes ago been ordered by one man, had been remapped. On the sidewalk, Rebecca's steps were deliberate. Her shoes made the click the title had promised, the sound of a woman walking him a life she'd never sought to make her own. It sounded perfectly ordinary against the city's ambient noise. Bus brakes, a delivery truck horn, the indistinct chatter of a lunchtime crowd. But for Rebecca, it was a closure of small gestures. The ring off her finger, the envelope closed behind glass, the seat she refused. She had no grand farewell. She had instead a quiet exit. Elias watched her go from across the street. He had moved enough pieces to shift the room. He had recognized the insignia and, with the economy of his resources, set the firm on a new axis. He didn't move to stop her. That would have turned curiosity into ownership. Instead, he respected the calculus she had offered. Truth, not position.
Later that week, the firm announced a formal review. They disclosed that an independent audit found breaches of governance and inconsistencies that required remediation, and they promised a transparent process. Lang resigned amid the review's acceleration. The board accepted his resignation rather than entertain a protracted fight.
Leela's status at the firm went as quietly as an exit, a name removed from the org chart, and a story someone told in whispers. The money that had paused moved in strange ways. Some clients returned after assurances and fresh oversight. Others did not. The firm lost momentum, and with it, the complacency that had enabled so much dust to gather in its corners. Brandt, who had once been a sentinel of legacy, spoke publicly about the need for institutions to reconcile the past with contemporary governance. Elias resumed his relationship cautiously, requiring new transparency and periodic reviews. The public story was tidy enough for a press release, but messy enough to make insiders uncomfortable. Rebecca received a single email from a former colleague. "Are you okay?" It was as intimate as anything. She replied with a sentence that doubled as a boundary and a map. "I'm fine. The ring is with the board." Truth mattered more than a chair. She went back to her life, but nothing about it was quite the same. People who had never noticed her mannerisms now recalled the day she had not fought back with heat, but with patience. Some admired it, others resented it. For Rebecca, the reward was private, the knowledge that she had honored her father's directive, not by claiming what he left, but by insisting the company he had tangential dealings with respect the written obligations they had once made. She had not wanted the seat, she wanted the ledger to be read honestly. Weeks later, when the dust had settled enough to let storylines congeal, Delgado sent Rebecca a note, a short, formal communiqué that also read like a private handshake. It said in carefully managed tones that the board had formalized an oversight mechanism respecting the legacy clause, and that they would ensure the protections were enforceable without centering a person who preferred not to sit as a figurehead. It was, in its way, a quiet victory for institutional memory. Rebecca kept working, but now with a narrow permission slip to request audits and access documents. She used it sparingly, in the way one uses antibiotics, only when the infection of complacency threatened to return. She found that power redistributed itself more often into systems than into personalities. She liked that better. The last image of that season, the one the office memory would cite when recounting the day, was simple and precise. A woman who had been mocked for her shoes and her ring, walking away, the soft click of her heels marking a cadence that was neither triumph nor surrender. It was a sound you could interpret however you wanted, the beat of dignity, the tempo of an ethical life, or the ordinary metronome of someone returning to the workday chosen. In boardrooms and small offices thereafter, the story functioned as a lesson not in cruelty's comeuppance, but in how institutional respect is often written in paper and hard to erase once the right eyes find it. People would tell the anecdote differently. Some embellished, some reduced it, but the skeleton remained. An entitled insult, a recognition that changed the room, and a careful woman who refused the ladder offered to her and chose instead to keep the ledger honest. If you liked this kind of corporate unspooling, where a single gesture can tilt an entire company, and where quiet attention sometimes does more than loud ambition, subscribe, and we'll bring you more cases of small people making large reckonings. Would you have taken the board seat? Leave a comment. I'm curious how you would measure the cost of visible power.